What if I told you there once lived a man so powerful that even the President of the United States had to beg him for help? A man whose signature on a single piece of paper could prevent the collapse of America's entire financial system. This isn't a modern-day billionaire, nor is it some shadowy Wall Street corporation. This was one man, J.P. Morgan, the banker who, for a time, owned not just railroads and steel, but America's very future. His influence was so immense that newspapers described him not as a businessman, but as a king without a crown. Imagine one man having the ability to dictate whether industry survived or collapsed, whether Wall Street thrived or burned, and whether the American government itself could pay its debts. That was the world of J.P. Morgan, but here's the dark twist: Morgan wasn't simply a genius banker who saved the U.S. economy. His power was built on ruthless ambition, secret deals, and an iron grip over every sector he touched. While Rockefeller controlled oil and Carnegie commanded steel, Morgan went after something far more valuable: control of money itself. And with money comes the power to bend nations. He didn't just play the game of wealth, he rewrote the rules, and then forced everyone else, governments, corporations, even rival millionaires, to play by his terms. His rise wasn't glamorous. Morgan was no movie star tycoon. In fact, he was physically scarred, plagued by illness, and notoriously private. But behind that stern face and piercing eyes was a man obsessed with control. Control over markets, over people, over the destiny of the United States. He became the architect of monopolies, the guardian of financial stability, and the shadow ruler behind the curtain of American politics. So the question is, how did one man, in an era filled with titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt, become the most feared of them all? How did J.P. Morgan rise to a level of power where he didn't just influence money, he was money? In this episode, we peel back the layers of his empire, expose the ruthless deals that built his fortune, and reveal how he once single-handedly saved, and nearly destroyed, America's economy. To understand how J.P. Morgan became the most powerful banker in history, we first need to step back into his beginnings, because his rise was not born out of charm or charisma, but out of something far more personal: insecurity and obsession. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 into wealth, but unlike other titans like Rockefeller, who clawed their way up from nothing, Morgan inherited privilege from the start. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was already a successful financier based in London, and young Pierpont was groomed to carry on the family's banking legacy, but there was a problem. From a young age, Morgan's health was fragile. He suffered from seizures, chronic headaches, and a severe skin condition known as rosacea, which left his nose bulbous and purple. In an era where appearance and presence meant everything, Morgan hated being photographed and often avoided public attention. The great irony is that the man who would come to symbolize power and dominance in America started his life hiding his face, plagued by self-doubt, and battling the feeling that he needed to prove himself. Education became his weapon. Morgan was shipped off to Europe, where he studied mathematics, finance, and languages, eventually graduating from the University of Göttingen in Germany. Unlike Rockefeller, who was famously frugal, or Carnegie, who was a master salesman, Morgan's strength was discipline, precision, and a near-military obsession with order. He learned to view the world through ledgers and balance sheets, not emotions. If something didn't balance, he fixed it. If a company failed, he reorganized it. To him, chaos was the enemy, and control was the cure. By the time he returned to America, he was not just the son of a banker, he was already being groomed as a banker himself. But what separated Morgan from the dozens of other wealthy young men of his generation was his cold determination. His physical weaknesses only fueled his hunger for control. He would never be the charismatic showman or the flamboyant millionaire throwing lavish parties. Instead, he chose to build power silently, strategically, and relentlessly. And soon, he would discover the perfect tool to impose order on chaos: the railroads. By the late 1800s, America's railroads were the veins and arteries of the nation. They connected cities, carried goods, and fueled industrial growth. But with rapid expansion came chaos, bankrupt lines, unsafe tracks, and bitter competition that left the industry in constant turmoil. This was the chaos J.P. Morgan craved to dominate, and the railroads became his battlefield. Morgan wasn't interested in simply owning trains. He wanted control over the entire system. He realized that too many competing companies were driving each other into bankruptcy, so he devised a ruthless solution: force them to merge. One by one, he reorganized struggling railroads, slashing costs, laying off workers, and squeezing every ounce of profit. He wasn't afraid to sit executives in a room, lock the doors, and refuse to let anyone leave until a deal was signed. This iron-fisted style of negotiation became known as Morganization. The results were staggering. By the 1890s, Morgan controlled some of the most important lines in the country, including the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad. His rail empire covered thousands of miles, making him the undisputed king of America's transportation network. If a company wanted to expand westward, they needed Morgan's permission. If goods needed to move, they likely moved across Morgan-controlled tracks. In short, he transformed railroads from a chaotic industry into an orderly monopoly, but at a heavy cost. Workers despised him. Entire towns that depended on rail jobs were gutted after his reorganizations. Ticket prices soared, while small businesses found themselves squeezed out by his iron rules. But to Morgan, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. He genuinely believed that without his control, the entire railroad system, and perhaps the nation itself, would collapse. In his mind, he wasn't just a businessman. He was a savior, keeping America's heartbeat steady through sheer willpower. It was through the railroads that Morgan established his reputation as the man who could stabilize industries, no matter how broken they seemed. But railroads were just the beginning. His appetite for control would soon lead him into steel, banking, and even the government itself. If the railroads gave J.P. Morgan control over America's arteries, steel gave him control over its bones. By the dawn of the 20th century, steel was the foundation of modern life. It built the bridges, the railroads, the skyscrapers, and the weapons of war. And no man embodied steel like Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had clawed his way from poverty to become the richest industrialist in America, and his empire dominated steel production. But Morgan saw something more than just profits. He saw the chance to create the first billion-dollar corporation in history. The deal was as bold as it was ruthless. In 1901, Carnegie was ready to step away from business, and Morgan pounced. He arranged a secret meeting, where Carnegie scribbled a number on a piece of paper, the price he wanted for his steel empire. The figure? An astonishing $480 million. Without hesitation, Morgan agreed. In that single stroke of a pen, U.S. Steel was born. It wasn't just the largest company of its time, it was the first corporation valued at more than $1 billion, an amount so vast that ordinary Americans could barely comprehend it. For Carnegie, it was a triumph. He retired as one of the richest men alive, devoting his fortune to philanthropy and libraries. But for Morgan, the real prize wasn't wealth, it was control. With U.S. Steel, Morgan held the backbone of America in his grip. Every skyscraper rising in New York, every battleship forged for the Navy, every rail laid across the continent, they all bore the mark of Morgan's empire. Yet not everyone celebrated. Critics accused him of creating a monopoly so vast it strangled competition. Politicians warned that one man controlling such power was dangerous for democracy itself. But Morgan brushed off the criticism. To him, U.S. Steel wasn't a monopoly. It was stability. It was order. It was the inevitable march of progress, guided by his steady hand. And with steel under his command, Morgan's reputation as America's ultimate power broker reached new heights. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan had gone beyond steel and railroads. His true kingdom was Wall Street, and here, he didn't just play the game of finance, he owned the board. In an era before strict regulations, when the stock market was more of a gamble than a science, Morgan transformed chaos into control. He created an informal empire where no major deal in America could happen without his blessing. If a railroad wanted to expand, if a company sought funding, if a merger needed financing, the first stop was not the White House or Congress. It was J.P. Morgan's office. Morgan's offices at 23 Wall Street, nicknamed the Corner, became the nerve center of American capitalism. Deals were struck behind closed doors, with Morgan seated like a king, cigar in hand, his cold eyes piercing through financiers desperate for his approval. He had a way of cutting through nonsense, demanding facts, figures, and order. Those who failed to impress him were dismissed. Those who succeeded found themselves backed by the most powerful banker in the world, but this immense power came with controversy. Critics accused Morgan of being less a banker and more a dictator of finance, a man who bent the market to his will. And in many ways, they were right. Morgan understood that control wasn't about owning everything himself, it was about pulling the strings. Through influence, alliances, and sheer intimidation, he built what was often called the money trust, a network of financial power so vast that even governments tread carefully. Small bankers and investors loathed him, but they also feared him. Competing financiers knew that without Morgan's approval, they would be crushed by his influence. Even rival millionaires like Rockefeller occasionally had to bow to his authority. For Morgan, Wall Street wasn't just a marketplace. It was his empire, and every stock, every bond, every dollar that passed through it was under his shadow. In an age of industrial titans, J.P. Morgan proved that the most valuable commodity of all wasn't oil, or steel, or railroads. It was money itself. And Morgan was the man who controlled it. In 1907, the United States stood on the brink of financial collapse. Banks were failing, the stock market was crashing, and ordinary Americans were rushing to withdraw their money in panic. It was the kind of crisis that could wipe out entire industries and plunge the nation into depression. The government was powerless, there was no Federal Reserve yet, no safety net to stabilize the economy. And in this void of leadership, one man stepped forward. Not the president. Not Congress. It was J.P. Morgan. When panic gripped Wall Street, Morgan locked the doors of his library on Madison Avenue and summoned the nation's top bankers. The scene was like something out of a thriller, powerful men pacing the room. Voices raised in desperation, knowing that without action, the system would collapse. Morgan sat at the head of the table, calm, collected, his piercing gaze cutting through the chaos. He listened, he calculated, and then he commanded. Banks would pool their resources. Stronger institutions would bail out weaker ones. And no one would leave his library until a deal was reached. For 24 tense hours, America's financial future was negotiated under Morgan's roof. When the smoke cleared, he had orchestrated a rescue plan worth millions, all without a single vote in Congress or a word from the president. The panic eased, the market stabilized, and J.P. Morgan was hailed as the man who had saved America. Newspapers compared him to a modern Caesar, the emperor of finance who held the republic in his hands. But behind the praise lay a disturbing truth. If one man could save the economy, it meant that one man also had the power to destroy it. Critics warned that Morgan had become too powerful, a private citizen wielding authority greater than the government itself. And they weren't wrong. In that moment, J.P. Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was the United States' unofficial central bank. His dominance made it clear, America's economy was not guided by democracy, but by the will of a single financier. After the panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan's reputation wasn't just national, it was global. His banking house, known as the House of Morgan, became the beating heart of international finance. From London to Paris, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, the Morgan name was whispered with both fear and reverence. This wasn't simply a bank. It was an empire, one that moved armies, built industries, and reshaped the destinies of nations. Morgan's empire controlled billions in today's money. Railroads? He dominated them. Steel? He had already forged U.S. Steel into the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Shipping? He created the International Mercantile Marine Company, which included the White Star Line, the same line that owned the Titanic. From coal to copper, electricity to banking, if it made money, Morgan either owned it, controlled it, or had influence over it, but the House of Morgan's true strength lay in its global alliances. Morgan bankers were seated at the same tables as the Rothschilds of Europe and the Warburgs of Germany. Together, they financed governments, brokered peace treaties, and supplied weapons for war. Morgan didn't just serve kings and presidents, he decided who got funded, who went bankrupt, and, in some cases, who won or lost wars. The House of Morgan was, in effect, a shadow government for the industrialized world. By the early 20th century, if a nation wanted to build railways, develop industries, or modernize its military, chances are they came knocking on Morgan's door. Even the U.S. Treasury borrowed money directly from him. Imagine that, the government of the United States depending on a private banker to keep its financial system alive. That was the staggering level of power the House of Morgan wielded. Yet with power came resentment. Many Americans looked at Morgan's mansion, his yachts, and his private art collection and saw not success, but arrogance. To them, the House of Morgan represented everything wrong with capitalism, unchecked greed, monopoly, and a dangerous concentration of power. To his supporters, he was a savior. To his critics, he was a tyrant in a banker's suit. But no one could deny one fact: J.P. Morgan was not just a man. He was an institution. While J.P. Morgan's empire dominated railroads, steel, and banking, his personal life reflected a stark contrast: private, obsessive, and surprisingly cultured. Known for his stern demeanor and imposing presence, Morgan had little tolerance for frivolity or public exposure. Unlike flamboyant titans like Carnegie or Rockefeller, Morgan rarely made public speeches and avoided the media spotlight. Yet, behind the closed doors of his Fifth Avenue mansion and private libraries lay a man with immense taste, intellect, and contradictions. Morgan was a devoted collector of art, rare books, and antiquities. His mansion contained masterpieces that would now fill entire museums, paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that reflected both his refined taste and desire for legacy. Collecting wasn't just a hobby, it was a statement. Through art, Morgan signaled that power and wealth weren't merely about money, but about culture, influence, and immortality. Every acquisition was a demonstration of control, a way to command history itself. And then there's the Titanic, an incident that highlights Morgan's complex world. Morgan had financed the White Star Line through his International Mercantile Marine Company, the same company that owned the Titanic. However, in a twist of fate, Morgan canceled his voyage on the ship at the last minute due to business obligations. While thousands perished in the icy Atlantic, Morgan survived, a reminder of both his meticulous planning and uncanny influence over fate. Critics saw irony, supporters saw destiny. Either way, it added another layer to the aura of untouchable power that surrounded him. Morgan's contradictions didn't end there. He was ruthless in business but generous in philanthropy, donating millions to hospitals, universities, and libraries. He demanded order, yet surrounded himself with the chaos of vast enterprises. He controlled nations' finances yet lived a life of strict personal discipline, rising early, eating modestly, and devoting long hours to reading ledgers. These contrasts made him enigmatic, part banker, part cultural titan, part shadow ruler. Ultimately, J.P. Morgan's personal life reflected the duality of his empire. His public persona was one of fear, power, and control. His private life revealed intellect, taste, and subtle humanity. Together, they created a man who wasn't simply wealthy, but almost mythic, a figure whose influence extended far beyond money into culture, fate, and history itself. J.P. Morgan's influence didn't end with his death in 1913. In many ways, it only transformed into institutions designed to ensure that no single man could ever hold such unchecked power again. The panic of 1907 had revealed the terrifying truth: the U.S. economy was vulnerable to the whims of one extraordinarily powerful banker. Lawmakers, politicians, and economists realized that if a private citizen like Morgan could stabilize or collapse the nation's finances overnight, there had to be a better system. This revelation directly led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, designed to distribute financial authority across multiple institutions rather than concentrated in the hands of a single person. Yet while the Federal Reserve limited individual power, it could not erase the legacy of Morgan's empire. His banking dynasty, known as the House of Morgan, continued to shape global finance for decades. Generations of Morgan bankers financed wars, industrial projects, and governments across the globe. From underwriting World War I efforts to controlling credit flows to emerging economies, the family's influence remained monumental. Their strategies became a blueprint for modern investment banking, mergers, and international finance. Morgan's legacy also extended beyond raw finance. He had proven that wealth and control were inseparable, and that a single individual, armed with intelligence, audacity, and vision, could bend entire industries to his will. Modern bankers, investors, and corporate titans still study his methods, analyzing his mergers, his crisis management, and his uncanny ability to command respect and fear simultaneously. But the story of Morgan is more than just banking history. It's a lesson in power, influence, and human ambition. He demonstrated the fragility of democratic systems in the face of concentrated financial authority and left a mark on society, politics, and culture that echoes to this day. Morgan didn't just play the game of money, he rewrote its rules, leaving behind a legacy both revered and feared, one that set the stage for the modern financial world. In the end, J.P. Morgan's life reminds us that wealth is not merely accumulation, it is influence, control, and the ability to shape the destiny of nations, a power that few men in history have ever held. J.P. Morgan's story is one of contrasts, extremes, and astonishing power. From a sickly, private young man to the most feared financier in the world, Morgan's life illustrates how wealth, intelligence, and ruthlessness can combine to shape nations. He didn't just amass money, he wielded it like a weapon, a tool, and even a shield, controlling industries, governments, and economies with the precision of a master strategist. Every railroad he reorganized, every steel deal he brokered, and every stock he manipulated was a calculated step toward creating an empire that would endure long after his death. But what makes Morgan truly fascinating is not just his financial genius, it's the human contradictions within him. He was a man of immense taste and culture, collecting priceless art, rare books, and antiquities. He was disciplined, private, and austere, yet commanded power over millions of lives. He saved the U.S. economy during the Panic of 1907, yet his dominance exposed the fragility of the nation itself. He was revered by some, feared by many, and criticized relentlessly by others, a figure who existed both as a myth and a man. Morgan's influence created a ripple effect that continues today. The House of Morgan became a blueprint for modern banking, the Federal Reserve a direct response to his singular power, and Wall Street remains a stage where influence, strategy, and control often outweigh mere wealth. Every major financial institution, corporate merger, and crisis management strategy can trace a thread back to his methods. He taught the world that money is not just currency, it is influence, leverage, and authority. As we look back at J.P. Morgan, we are forced to ask ourselves difficult questions. What does it mean when one person can wield such immense power? How do wealth, ambition, and control intersect in shaping history? And perhaps most chillingly, who holds that power today? Morgan's life is both a cautionary tale and a masterclass in strategy, a lesson that money alone is never the measure of power, it's the reach, the influence, and the ability to dictate the world around you that defines true domination. So as we close this chapter of our series, remember this: Morgan didn't just shape finance, he shaped the destiny of a nation. And his shadow still lingers over Wall Street, over banking, and over the very idea of wealth itself.